First of all, I would like to thank you very much for having me here, for inviting me to this conference, and apologize for being present only in this virtual form. I'm not an expert on Reschnitz, and I leave it to my colleagues presenting at this panel to discuss this case in detail. Therefore, in my talk, I do not focus specifically on Reschnitz, but on a broader context in which a search for the dead undertaken in Reschnitz can be placed, and on a conceptual frame through which it can be analyzed. This is structured around several notions: that of the return of the dead, of necropolitics as the politics of dead bodies, and the forensic turn, which are meant to foreground the significance of material presence, search for, and investigation of human remains in the aftermath of political violence. I will also take a closer look at the specificity of forensic and archaeological investigations in the context of the Holocaust, framed to a large extent by religiously grounded permissions and prohibitions absent in other cultural contexts. The Jewish religious law, the Halacha, basically prohibits all interference into the place of burial, and this includes invasive archaeological research, disturbance of the dead, exhumation, dislocations, and the reburial of the dead. And yet, the very context in which the death unfolded and the way in which the bodies were disposed of, far removed from, if not a negation of a dignified burial, open space for reflection on the nature of such graves. Drawing from a recent debate in the Holocaust studies, I will reframe them later on as body disposal piece. Finally, I will address the importance of and the reasons for the search and recovery of human remains resulting from the Holocaust in humanitarian terms, and the ethics and politics of knowledge crucial for critical engagement with the crimes committed during the Second World War and their material legacies. The cultural and political position of the dead and death has always been subject to change, reflecting and initiating broader social transformations. Entangled in a dense network of social, political, and economic relations, religious and cultural beliefs, legal frameworks, and technological developments. These responses to and attitudes towards death and the dead have invariably mirrored and articulated alterations of many central life, aspects of social life and shifts in cultural self-understanding. In my research and in our project, Globalized Memorial Museums, we build upon the recognition that the last decades have witnessed yet another dramatic shift in the role played by death and the dead for contemporary societies, their politics and cultures. Challenging the diagnosis proposed in the 70s by Philippe Ariès, according to which death has become effectively invisibilized or indeed forbidden in the contemporary Western world, I argue that the dead have returned, invested with unprecedented power to organize imagination, structure memory politics, and make social worlds. Structured around the concept of necropolitics and focusing mainly on mass death resulting from political violence, for instance, the Second World War, the Holocaust, Rwanda genocide, the Srebrenica genocide, our project looks at multifaceted ramifications of the material, cultural, and affective presence of the dead and the dense politics that surrounds them. The meaning of necropolitics introduced here diverges, therefore, from the one already established in the field of political philosophy and critical theory. For scholars such as Achille Mbembe or Giorgio Agamben, the term encompasses the sovereign's right to expose others to death, to dictate who may live and who must die, capturing the shift from a political regime that administers life, that is biopower, to one based on the imposition of death. Instead, I construct necropolitics as a multi-layer and multifaceted set of political, cultural, religious, and material processes for which the dead are being managed, governed, inscribed with meaning, represented, mobilized symbolically and politically, subjected to social, cultural, and or political inclusion or exclusion, but also those for which the dead exert a material and affective impact. The notion of necropolitics pertains as much to practices of killing and disposition of corpses by perpetrators as to their handling and framing in the aftermath of violence by affected communities, authorities, state and investigative bodies, and also by researchers tasked with recovering and analyzing human remains, such as archaeologists or forensic experts. Whereas political violence and resulting mass death are by no means new phenomena, recent decades have seen a radical change in the way their material legacies are being managed, investigated, framed, represented, and experienced. One of the most important developments leading to and epitomizing this transformation is the globally unfolding turn towards forensics and forensic investigation as a means to unearth, address, collect, preserve, and present the evidence of war crimes, genocides, and human rights violations. Since the 80s, throughout the world, mass graves of the immediate and more distant past are being opened, investigated, and exhumed. Initiated in the 80s in the Southern Hemisphere in Argentina, Peru, Guatemala, Chile, and Colombia, the forensic turn has been successfully broadening its geographical and temporal reach, extending to the graves of the Yugoslav wars, of the Second World War, of the Spanish Civil War, of the First World War, and others. This normalization of forensic investigation in the context of political violence has therefore asserted the importance of the dead as bodies searched for, exhumed, and reburied for individual and collective engagements with political violence, and for its juridical, political, and artistic framings. For a long time, Holocaust landscapes have been immune to material interventions in the form of forensic and archaeological research. Until the late 50s, the recovery, exhumation, investigation, and reburial of human remains certainly took place, and the graves at the former Nazi camps were examined in the early post-war years by various investigative commissions, whether Soviet, Polish, US, or French. However, those early practices were not systematic and still remain relatively unknown. The same can be said about investigations that unfolded in the 60s. The dynamic geography of forensic investigations has only recently been extended to the Nazi camps, and even more recently also to the Holocaust killing sites. Beginning in the 90s and the 20s, various archaeological projects have been launched at the sites in Germany, Austria, or Poland, including those not necessarily framed as forensic. The later encompass interventions which are instrumental in setting up new memorialization plans for the sites, for instance, aiming to establish the exact location of the body disposal pits in order to protect them, or in tracing and collecting the material evidence at the former camps. This includes forensic archaeological research at Treblinka, led by Caroline Strady-Coles, or Paul Mitchell's work at the concentration camp in Mauthausen, Marek Jasiński research at Falstad in Norway, or the research conducted by an international archaeological team at the former extermination camp in Sobibor, and many, many others. What distinguishes the vast majority of these investigations from those carried out in other contexts of political violence is the fact that they are rarely performed within the remit of legal investigations. Poland is an exception here. The Institute of National Remembrance continues to commission forensic research to support their investigations into the crimes committed in Poland during the Second World War. This was, for instance, the case with Dziuban, the location of the 1941 pogrom on the Jewish inhabitants of the town by non-Jewish Poles, or more recently at the former labor camp in Treblinka, just 3 kilometers away from the notorious extermination camp. But the Holocaust investigations are also distinguished by the fact that they are effectively governed by halakhically sanctioned rabbinical prohibition against disturbing and exhuming burial sites of their predominantly Jewish victims, and are carried under strict rabbinical supervision. Whereas the objective may be to determine the outlines of the graves, uncover material structures of the camp's infrastructures, such as gas chambers, barracks, wells, and collect objects that belong to the victims, sometimes enabling in this way their identification, the remains of the dead are in principle not uncovered, exhumed, and investigated. And this indeed is not without necropolitical implications. The religious framing and compliance with its regulation translates into the way the dead are being inscribed with identity, subjectified in collective terms as Jewish, the ownership claims to them asserted. While this has motivated some contemporary archaeologists working at the former Nazi camps and mass killing sites to devise new methodological approaches, as is the case with Caroline Strady-Coles, who frames her own application of non-invasive methods in terms of research ethics rooted in responsiveness to religious sensitivities, the issue remains contentious. This was the case, for instance, in Jedwabne. In 2000, after the publication of Jan Tomasz Gross's Neighbors, which brought attention to the pogrom, the newly established Institute of National Remembrance opened an investigation into the case. Due to religiously motivated objections of many rabbinical authorities in Poland and abroad, the graves in Jedwabne were never fully opened. Human remains were not taken to forensic laboratories for further analysis. Only the top layer of two body disposal pits was removed to uncover human remains, which were then examined on site. The archaeologists and forensic medicine experts involved in the investigation had the permission to forensically examine exclusively those remains which were spread over the area and were not in anatomical order, that is, the ashes and small pieces of bones. But as mentioned above, the vast majority of archaeological investigations at the former Holocaust sites are not performed to yield evidence that is to be presented in juridical forums. Instead, they are framed in humanitarian terms. This speaks to a profound shift in the very meaning of forensic investigations, identified as a refocusing of the forensic efforts from merely legal, that is, prosecution of perpetrators, to predominantly humanitarian, that revolve around the dead, their identification, and return to family members for burial, and around reconstructing narrative of past events. In the context of the Holocaust, the forensic term implies simultaneously a deployment of forensic methods at the scenes of crime to recover evidence of physical and cultural genocide, and simultaneously an ethically driven reorientation of archaeological practice towards fulfilling humanitarian goals, identified here with a broadly defined right to know. Right to know, for instance, through locating unmarked graves and through revealing information about lost culture and the people to which it relates. It is in these terms, too, that I would frame the importance of the search for the remains of the victims of the Resins massacre. But the notion of a humanitarian aspect of a forensic investigation speaks to the need of restoring the humanitarian dimension of those deaths and at undoing the inhumane or dehumanizing treatment to which they had been subjected. This has been further strengthened by the increasing importance of material practices around human remains or originating from various episodes of political violence. In this context, the searching for bodies, their exhumation, identification, and reburial have been reconfigured in the categories of care. This care constitutes a strong opposition and thus actually the violence to which the remains are subjected by perpetrators. The hiding of corpses, burying them in unmarked graves, leaving them unburied, the mutilation, destruction, for instance, through burning, the looting of the bodies or collecting body parts as trophies. All posthumously objectify and dehumanize the dead. This is how such practices are definitely experienced by the loved ones of the dead and quite often framed in these terms by the law. On a theoretical level, the incentive to reconceptualize this modality of violence affecting human remains accompanied the advent of the research on the politics of dead bodies, necropolitics, and necrogovernmentality. This perspective made it abundantly clear that not only living bodies, but also those of the dead are subject to sovereign power, to politicization and depoliticization, to inclusion and exclusion, from political and legal communities through a multitude of social and material practices. Extending the work of power to encompass the reality of death, they established dead bodies as political subjects. It is from this point of view, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that the notion of a grave becomes somewhat problematic in reference to the location of unmarked and uncommemorated remains dating back to the Holocaust, including the one searched for in Lesznic. Following recent developments in the discursive field of Holocaust studies, many scholars refrain, therefore, from framing the locations of human remains resulting from the Holocaust as mass graves and construct them instead as body disposal pits. This is to acknowledge that to deny the victim the right to a burial was an additional, posthumously dehumanizing form of violence perpetrated by the Nazis. It becomes therefore all the more important to search for them and to locate them in order for the body disposal pits to be marked, protected, and commemorated, even if such find will not lead to exhumation and reburial due to religiously motivated prohibition to disturb and move the dead. Such protection and marking becomes a means of transformation of a body disposal pit into a grave and a sign of posthumous care of the dead. There is something incredibly frustrating and disturbing about the continuous failure to find the dead in Lesznic. And yet the very fact that the search is undertaken time and again fosters a critical engagement with the crimes committed during the Second World War and their legacies, at least among activists and scholars. And actually, I'm all the more happy to be here with you to acknowledge and thank you for your persistent work. Hopefully, one day, this engagement will yield material results and will translate into a proper, if only symbolic, burial of the victims of Lesznic's massacre.